Hi class, in this video we are starting chapter 8, which is the memory chapter. And the first thing I want to do is show you these pictures. Just a heads up, this right here is the early bird who got stuck getting the worm. We'll talk about that later. Just don't write that down, just deal with it later. Okay, let's get into memory. For this, we are going to be talking about all the stages of memory. In general, memory is the set of processes used to encode, store, and retrieve information over different periods of time. And so the different stages we're going to be talking about, the different things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about sensory memory, that very initial stage. We're going to talk about working or short-term memory. We're going to talk about long-term memory, and then the processes of moving between these different stages. We'll talk about encoding, we'll talk about retrieval, we'll talk about automatic and effortful processing, all this sort of stuff. But this is sort of the diagram of what we're covering this entire semester, or not this entire semester, this entire chapter. But let's first get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is the different types of encoding. So how information gets sort of into this process to begin with. Encoding is the input of information into the memory system. There are generally two ways to do encoding. You can do automatic processing or effortful processing. If you do automatic processing, this is the encoding of details. So things like time, space, frequency, meaning of words. I'll give you a couple of examples of these. For example, if you have ever been taking a test and then you remember that you know that you learned a definition, you remember studying it, and you can picture where on the page it was, you weren't trying to memorize that. When you're studying, you're not like, let me remember this was at the top of the page. That's not a thing. But when you're taking the test, that'll come back to you. That is automatic processing for space, where on the page it was. If you lose your ID and you have to retrace your steps, that is time, automatic processing for time. It's not like every time you went somewhere throughout the day, you stopped and said, let me make sure I remember I was here at 9:30 in the morning in case I need to come back. No, but if you think about it, you can retrace your steps. Frequency is, oh gosh, for example, I lost power at my house for a few hours today. And when it happened, I said, oh my goodness, this is the third day in a row that we've lost power for a little bit. That is frequency. It's not like every time I lose power at my house, because it's a lot, that I stop and say, let me make sure I remember that this is the third time we've lost power or the fourth time we've lost power. So if it happens again, I can comment on it. But it just happens, you remember that sort of thing. So that is the automatic processing. Without effort, this stuff goes into your memory. And towards the end of the chapter, we'll talk about another version of automatic processing, which is flashbulb memories. That'll be another version of this, but for this point, that's all you need to know. Effortful processing requires a lot of work and attention. This is the stuff you are trying to put into your memory. This is you studying for a test. You are trying to remember this thing. So a little bit more on encoding. There are a few different types of encoding. You can have semantic, visual, or acoustic encoding. If you encode, and I'm going to actually start backwards and work up. If you encode acoustically, you are encoding for sounds. Like words are going to fall into this. So we encode the sounds that words make to try to get it into our memory. This is one reason we teach little kids through songs or rhyming. Like when I was trying to teach my kids my phone number, I have a little song I sing with my phone number, and it helps them remember it. Or, you know, little ditties like I before E, except after C. It rhymes. It's going to help you remember it. You are remembering how that sounds. That's acoustic encoding. Visual encoding is encoding of images. So it's a picture pops in your head as you're trying to remember it. This is one reason if you were given a list of words to memorize and you got one of two lists, and one word had things like dog, light bulb, sandwich, and the other list had things like truth, justice, freedom, it would be a lot easier to remember the list about sandwiches and light bulbs because you can picture them in your head. You can't really picture justice in your head. So visual encoding, images. And then finally, we have semantic encoding. Semantic encoding is the encoding of words and their meaning. So you remember the meaning of what the word is. And Bousfield did an experiment with this. When we are getting information into our memory, when we are encoding, we especially like to use semantic encoding. And so Bousfield's experiment, he gave people a list of 60 words to memorize, or, you know, remember as many as they could. And it turned out that the list was, there were technically 4 categories of words, like it was all mixed up within the 60, but there were 4 categories of words. And the participants, even though the words were all mixed up on the list, the participants tended to remember words by category. So as they were saying all the words they had remembered, all the ones that were about food, they said at the same time. All the ones about like animals, they would say at the same time. It's easier to remember it and put it in our memory if it has meaning for us. And so they just naturally found that meaning, did that semantic encoding as well. So which type of encoding you use affects how well you remember something. So specifically, what type of encoding gives the best memory of verbal information? If you were trying to remember something that somebody told to you, is it better to use visual, acoustic, or semantic encoding? And so actually, before you answer this, let me give you an idea of what that would entail so it's easier to remember it. This is what the Craik and Troelving experiment was. They gave participants words to remember, and they used one of these 3 types. So if it was visual encoding, they were asked about the font of the letters. So here's a list of words to remember. What do you think about this font? Because you're imagining the letters. For the acoustic encoding, they were asked about the sound of the words and if they could think of like any words that rhymed with that one. And then for semantic, they were asked, do you know what this word means? And then they were given an unexpected task to do, a recall recognition thing, basically to distract them. And then they were asked, which ones do you remember? So out of these 3, acoustic, visual, or encoding, what was easiest to remember? The answer is semantic encoding, the ones that were about meaning. It's easier to remember stuff if it has meanings. For example, if you are learning a song in a different language, if it's one that it's a language you speak, that you know some, it's easier to remember. If it is a language you don't know at all, it's going to be very difficult for you to remember the song because it doesn't have any meaning. You're just trying to use acoustic encoding, trying to remember what the sound is. If there has meaning, if you know what the words are, it's easier to remember it. And connected with this is a self-reference effect. It's a tendency for a person to have a better memory for information that relates to themselves in comparison to material that has less personal relevance. If it's something that is important to you, it relates to you, it's easier to remember it. If the first day of class, if everyone has to go around and say their name, if someone has the same name as one of your siblings, you'll remember their name easier because it means something to you. They have the same name as someone in your family. So it's easier to remember stuff that matches something that's personal to us or is somehow relevant to us. So that is it for encoding. The next thing we're going to start to go on about is storage, and we are going to spend a while on storage. Just a heads up. Storage is creating a permanent record of information. There are 3 stages to do this. You have sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory in the storage component. The idea that you have these 3 stages, sensory, short-term, and long-term, was proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin. It's called the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, and it's based on the belief that you process memories in the same way that a computer processes information. So when you are typing information in, that's going to be sensory. What you see on the screen before you save it is short-term. When you click save, that's long-term memory. It's now stored permanently. And then you retrieve it, you open a file that has been saved, retrieve something out of your memory. So we are going to start in on these stages. We'll go in the order sensory, short-term, long-term. For sensory memory, this is the storage of brief sensory events, things like sights, sounds, and tastes. And so this is acoustic is the sound, visual, and then taste memory. These are very short. For example, your visual sensory memory lasts less than a second, just a few tenths of a second. This is if you're sitting in the car in the passenger seat looking out the window as stuff's flying by, that's your sensory memory. If you don't think it's something you need to remember, if you're not seeing something interesting out the window, you're not gonna even get that into your short-term memory. It's just gonna stop there. You won't remember it a second later. That's that sight. Sensory memory. Sound, acoustic sensory memory lasts 3 to 4 seconds. It's a little bit longer. An example of this, if you are talking to someone and then you start tuning them out, you're not listening to them, and then they notice that you're not listening and they say, "What did I just say?" You can repeat the last few words that they said even though you weren't actually paying attention, you weren't trying to focus and remember what they were saying. That's because that is what was in your acoustic sensory memory. Without effort, without trying, you can remember just a few seconds of what you've just heard. And so according to the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, things from your environment are processed through this sensory memory first. Again, lasts just for a few seconds potentially, and if you don't think the information's valuable, it's going to leave your sensory memory. It's not even going to get to short term. If it's something important, then it will move to short-term memory. So we'll talk about short-term memory next. Short-term memory is a temporary storage system that processes incoming sensory memory, working memories, we call them. And so again, I'm just going to go back to this slide briefly so you can see what we've done so far. So we've talked about sensory memory. It's the senses, the sensory input coming into your eyes, in through your ears, your tongue, whatever it is. And then once it's in that sensory memory thing, if it's something that your brain says, yeah, this is important, then you will move it to your short-term memory. And that is through that encoding process. That's the first. There's 2 times encoding is going to take place. Moving from sensory to short-term, and then short-term to the next thing we talk about, long-term. But right now we're focusing on short-term memory. Your short-term memory is sometimes called working memory, but short-term memory is actually just a component of your working memory. Working memory is slightly bigger than just short-term memory. There's a couple of different ways to think about this. Oh, actually, let me talk about time frame capacity before we get into the Baddeley and Hitch idea. The time frame for short-term memory, how long does it last? Without effort, without trying to keep something in your short-term memory, it will last about 30 seconds, give or take. That varies slightly based on what type of thing you're trying to remember. So anywhere 20 to 30 seconds. And George Miller is the one who thought of that and the capacity. So for the capacity, how much information you can fit into your short-term memory, that is 7 plus or minus 2, which means anywhere from 5 to 9 pieces of information. Again, this is if you are not trying to expand the capacity of your short-term memory. And there are different ways you can expand the capacity of your short-term memory. So I'm gonna test your short-term memory now, the capacity of it, how much you can keep without trying. So the way we're going to do this is I am going to say ready, then I'm going to say a string of numbers, and then I'm going to say recall. So what I want you to do is after I say recall, I want you to write down the numbers I just said. So wait until after I've said recall to write them down. And so we're going to start at the bottom of the capacity. What is called the magic number. That's what George Miller called it, the magic number. And then we'll go all the way to well beyond it. I'll stop at 13 numbers in a row. Okay, so here we go. Ready? 4, 9, 2, 5, 6. Recall. So write those numbers down. And at the end, I'm going to give you these numbers again so you can know if you're right or wrong. Next one. Ready? 2, 6, 7, 1, 9, 8. Recall. Ready? 3, 9, 0, 6, 7, 5, 2. Recall. So that's sort of right in the middle of the magic number. Ready? 5, 7, 3, 2, 9, 1, 4, 3. Recall. Ready? 7, 2, 1, 3, 5, 4, 4, 5, 6. Recall. Ready? 2, 4, 5, 6, 1, 9, 8, 3, 2, 2. Recall. Ready? 1, 4, 1, 3, 8, 4, 5, 1, 5, 8, 9. Recall. And then finally, the last one. Ready? 2, 0, 1, 3, 1, 5, 4, 2, 6, 7, 6, 2. Recall. Okay, so that is the capacity for your short-term memory. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a question pop up where I will tell you what all the numbers were, and you have to tell me what's the most you got correct. So do that now. So chances are you didn't get the 13. You did not get the best one. Chances are your number was somewhere in that magic number range. So the next thing for this is Baddeley-Hitch. The Baddeley-Hitch model says that short-term memory has different forms. So storing memories in your short-term memory is like opening different files on a computer and adding information. And your memories are visual, spatial, episodic buffer, and the phenomenological loop, the phonological loop. So what these are, your visual spatial sketchpad is like a picture in your head, in your short-term memory. The episodic buffer is for events you're going to remember for a short term. And then the phonological loop is, it's like a recorder in your head. So it's for sounds. And then you technically have the central executive part, and that is what helps organize the visual spatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer, and the phonological loop. And so to do a little activity so you can kind of see how these three things work together and how these types of short-term memory connect to working memory and all. What I want you to do, we're going to do a few things. I'm going to say 5 words. Don't write the words down, but we're going to see if you can remember them. Keep them in your short-term memory. And it's 5, so that's the smaller end of that capacity. It should work. So the words are tree, mirror, Saturn, highway, electrode. And now I'm going to have you do things connected with these different things. So for the visual spatial sketchpad, do a calculation. What is 8 times 23? Don't use pencil, just use your head so like you know you've got the images. 8 times 23, what is that? So that is 184. Now for the episodic buffer, what I want you to do is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So do that with your fingers. It's an activity. Episodic buffer. And now for that phonological loop, say 5 letters of the alphabet starting at Z going backwards. So Z, Y, X, W, V. Let's just say those. Okay, so now that you've done these 3 things here, can you remember what those 5 words are? So write them here if you know. It might have been hard for you. By the way, the answers were highway, mirror, tree, Saturn, and electrode. And it was hard because it's not like it's just this capacity for your short-term memory and nothing's going to affect that. If your central executive part of your working memory, if the part that's trying to organize everything has to take resources away to do these other activities, that affects that capacity. It affects how long something can stay in your short-term memory because your processes are being used elsewhere. And so it can be difficult to remember it. By the way I remember it is I imagine it. So driving down a highway, looking in the rearview mirror, seeing a tree with Saturn, and it's like electrodes are going around the rings of Saturn. It helped me remember it. But that is your short-term memory. And actually, I'm going to stop this video here. And so the next video will all be about long-term memory and then problems with memory. So there's a chance the next one will be slightly over 30 minutes, probably not much, but then all the long-term memory information is together in one slide. So we'll stop there.